Hi everyone, this is Megan Jeltis,
And this is Hannah Pang.
and we're going to be talking to you about the cultural biases against people with disabilities.
Here is an overview of what we will be talking about in our presentation. We will first start off by explaining the different types of disabilities and the past perceptions of disabilities, as well as the way our society in the United States has progressed. We will then discuss some different statistics relating to disabilities, some common stereotypes that surround disabilities, and then we will go into 3 global perspectives, those of China, India, and the Philippines, and the way that those cultures perceive disabilities. Lastly, we will talk about what this means for us as counselors and as school counselors.
Here we list the different types of disabilities. There's visual, hearing, physical, mental health, intellectual or developmental, and learning. And what we found in our research is that most times people will just think of the word disability and instantly think of physical because it's one that you can see. However, it's important as counselors to be aware of all the different types. So before we get to current trends, it's important to look back. Before the disability rights movement and even during the movement, there were many hardships that people with disability faced. People with disabilities were often forced into mental hospitals and institutions. They were forced to receive ineffective medical treatments.
They were denied education, excluded from jobs or careers, not allowed to immigrate to our country. And then when Hannah and I were talking to Matt Taylor, who we did an interview with, he also let us know that some of the past perceptions about people with disabilities were that they were freaks or monsters in some way, and that even in the 1900s, people with disabilities were put into freak shows or circuses. So let's talk about the disability rights movement. While this movement started back in the 1800s, there were many advancements, but I wasn't able to fit them all just on 2 slides. But I pulled out some of the important dates that stuck out to me while doing the research. Some key moments. In 1817, the American School for the Deaf is founded in Hartford, Connecticut. This is actually the first school in the Western Hemisphere to be open for children with disabilities. In 1832, the Perkins School for the Blind is opened in Boston and admits 2 students. Then in 1841, Dorothea Dix, an activist for the disability rights movement, advocates for people with disabilities that are in jails and shelters. In 1909, New York schools begin using Braille in the classrooms. In 1963, JFK addresses Congress and advocates for the deinstitutionalization of people with disabilities. This was huge because, as I mentioned in the past perception slides, many people with disabilities at this time were being forced into mental hospitals and institutions instead of being provided with other supports and resources. In 1972, Mills v. Board of Education ruled that Washington, D.C. public schools were not allowed to prohibit children with disabilities from entering the schools. And then in 1990, probably the most monumental piece of legislation that passed during this movement was the Americans with Disabilities Act. This act is a broad civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based on a disability. It also requires employers to make reasonable accommodations for their employees with disabilities. Lastly, the law requires public accommodations to be accessible to everyone.
Now let's look at some of the statistics in the United States. According to the 2010 U.S. Census, 56.7 million people, which is 19% of the population, had a disability. This means that 1 in 5 people have a disability in the U.S. 20% of people with disabilities are female and 17% are male. 23% of people with a disability are in poverty. Now looking at statistics by age, 8% of children under 15 have a disability, 21% of people 15 and older have a disability, and looking at the population of 65 and older, 50% of them have a disability.
So looking at some of the statistics for our world, we found that 10% of the world's population identifies as having a disability. That's 650 million people. Again, more females than males. 80% of those with a disability live in a developing country, and 20% of the world's poorest people have some form of disability. And while we were looking for these statistics too, we wonder how accurate they truly are, because we thought about many third world countries. We're not sure really how they would even get these statistics out. So we hypothesized that actually the number is much larger.
Now let's look at some of the common stereotypes in our society today. So one of them is that the disability defines who the person is, meaning that sometimes people look at someone with a disability and only see the disability and not really look at the person as a whole and all the abilities that they do have. Another is that people with disabilities are sick or in constant pain. This is untrue because people with disabilities are just like people without disabilities in that sometimes they get sick and sometimes they have average aches and pains. Most of the time, people with disabilities are not in constant pain. Another common stereotype is that people with disabilities are superheroes and the pressure for them to be inspirational daily. We found a quote that summarizes this pretty well. George Covington, a writer who is blind, has said, "We are seen as inspirational, and inspiration sells like hotcakes. My disability isn't a burden, having to be so damned inspirational is." Another stereotype is that people with disabilities are special and should be treated differently. Another is that disability is a tragedy and deserves pity. But really, what it seems like the tragedy is the negative attitudes and perceptions that people have towards people with disabilities. Another is that people with disabilities are dependent and always need help. While sometimes people with disabilities do need assistance, it does not mean that they are dependent all the time. And lastly, people with disabilities only want to associate with each other.
Even with laws like Americans with Disabilities Act in our country, people with disabilities still face discrimination at times in our society. As we've learned in this class about overt and covert discrimination, an example of overt discrimination towards a person with a disability would be something like that person being harassed about their disability. Covert would be more of hidden discrimination, and Matt Taylor, who we interviewed for our presentation, will give a great example about covert discrimination in the video that you will watch after our PowerPoint presentation.
So now we move on to looking into the work environment, and we found some interesting statistics. We found that only 33% of people with a disability are employed between the ages of 18 to 64 years old. We found that 53% work as some sort of service worker, meaning in administration, sales, or management. And this one really stuck out to us. The median earnings in the last year for people with disabilities was only $19,735 compared to $30,285 for people without a disability.
Some common stereotypes in the workplace: that people with disabilities take more sick days, that they contribute to a high turnover rate in the workplace, that they are lazy, and that they are not as qualified.
In the school environment, one of the most prevalent disabilities that comes up is that of learning disabilities. One of the myths surrounding learning disabilities is that students who have them also have a low intellectual ability. This is not true, and it is our job to educate people of what is. The truth is that in order to be diagnosed with a learning disability, a student must show an intellectual ability that is of average to high. In the school environment, we also come across a lot of parents and teachers who do not have a lot of background knowledge and often misunderstand what the disabilities are. This often leads to having low expectations for students with disabilities, and this greatly impacts the student and how they view themselves and how they view what they are capable of accomplishing. It is our job to advocate for them. Another phenomena that happens in the school environment is that of the word of mouth. This means that, for example, if a 5th grade teacher were looking at her upcoming class and talking to the 4th grade teacher about the students, and the 4th grade teacher shared all of these stories of the problems and issues she had with a certain student who had a disability, the 5th grade teacher would expect that of the student, and without even having interacted with them, have a certain standard for them. So the student with a disability wouldn't even have a chance to show what they are actually capable of. So let's look at some of the global perspectives surrounding disabilities. First, we're going to look at that of China. China is relatively behind in the resources that they have for people of disabilities. As we looked at the historical timeline for the United States, the resources offered to people of disabilities started in the 1800s, whereas in China, the China Disabled Persons Federation did not even exist until 1988. We found that 95% of the mentally ill are unable to be admitted into a hospital, and that people with disabilities are often cared for by their family and community support. This goes along with the Chinese belief that they need to seek help from immediate and extended family first before turning to professionals. There is a high respect for elders, and that would be good to know as a counselor, because establishing a relationship with the parents or significant extended family members could help in the rehabilitation process for people with mental disabilities. In China, seeking help from social welfare or seeking help from the government can be seen as very intimidating, which also leads a lot of the families to seek help from their family and community before professionals. In China, one of the most prevalent perspectives on mental health is that mental health comes from self-discipline, an exercise of power, and avoidance of the morbid thoughts. Thus, a lot of what they perceive to be mental health lies within the individual and in the individual's power. Emotional problems are equivalent to having a weak character. And so a lot of what we do as mental health providers is to educate them so that they have a clear, more accurate view of what we do and what mental health entails. In China, there is often a misunderstanding or lack of knowledge surrounding disabilities, and this creates a lot of fear, hostility, alienation, or blame around people with disabilities. There was a story of a little boy in the Chinese newspaper who had acquired AIDS from a blood transfusion that he received for a broken arm. Immediately after his diagnosis of AIDS, he was expelled from his school, and no school will currently accept him due to his illness. He has also since lost all of his friends, as have his parents. One of his neighbors even moved after learning that he had contracted AIDS, and his neighbor's house is still empty because it won't sell. His father took him to see a doctor who told him, "Don't touch my desk," when he learned that he had AIDS. This is one example of how disabilities can be perceived in China due to the misunderstanding or lack of knowledge around it. So in China, one of the main focuses around disabilities is on why they happen and the cause of them. This is in contrast to what we see in the United States, where people are often focused on finding a solution or a treatment to help people with disabilities. This is because in Chinese culture, disabilities are often viewed as shameful. They are viewed as a punishment for the disabled person's parental or past life sins. This belief often creates a lot of guilt surrounding the disability by both the family and the individual with a disability. These feelings can create conflicts and barriers to acceptance among family members and be extremely dividing. In China, they are, however, more accepting of acquired disabilities. There have also recently been more establishments of segregated special education schools. This is also in contrast to what we see in the United States, where we have adopted more of an inclusion concept, where we integrate special education into our mainstream classrooms. In China, however, this is not really the case. Therefore, as a school counselor, counseling a Chinese family and a Chinese student with a disability, you might encounter parents who fear that their child cannot receive an appropriate education or get the attention they need in a mainstream classroom. They may also fear that their child will be stigmatized and laughed at by students without disabilities. And due to language barriers, they might not be able to share their concerns with you. Therefore, as a school counselor, it's really important that we are ready and willing to address these issues and approach the parents first. So let's move to the global perspective in India. In India, there are about 90 million people with disabilities, and these people comprise a highly marginalized group. Many times, the only exposure that people in India have with people with disabilities are seeing them on the side of the road begging for money. They view their impairment as a use to solicit money. In India, little help is given to children of lifelong disabilities. This is because of many reasons. One of the main ones is because of their religious belief in karma, that the disability is a payment for their past deeds. Another reason is because rehabilitation services are not really easily available to the majority of the population in India, and so little help is sought for children with lifelong disabilities. The economic hardship, poor transport facilities, lack of education of parents really makes it harder for them to access services for their children. In India, they also see their children as an investment for the future. So when a child is born with a disability, many of the families do not see that child as a source of support or income in the future. And so they'd rather spend their money on healthy children, especially the male children. In India, acquired disabilities often receive much more resources than genetic disabilities. This is because when a person acquires a disability, people tend to view them as previously fully functional, and they have a hope that they will one day become fully functional again. And so a lot of effort is made to provide services for this to happen. For example, in one particularly wealthy family, the male member, who also happened to be the provider of the family, was involved in a train accident and had to have both of his lower limbs amputated. The family saw that he received proper medical treatment, that he had prosthetic limbs manufactured and fitted, that he got his car adapted for him so that he would be fully functional again. But in that same family, a child was born with severe physical deformities. And although the family took care of that person for their entire life and attended all their basic needs, they never sought outside help to seek to make him more independent. In India, there is also a large value on altruism for the sake of the family and larger community. As a result, empowerment of the individual is often perceived to be selfish and undesirable, whereas being altruistic for the sake of their family and for the larger society has a much higher value. In India, integration into the schools is extremely recent. Up until this point, most people viewed people with disabilities as beggars and unable to receive an education. In India, disabilities are often seen as family disabilities because the individual and the family are so closely connected. As a result, the stress is shared by the whole family, especially the women in the household, and it's oftentimes the women who are expected to care for the child or the person with the disability. This leads me to my next point, which is that the most severe expressions of gender discrimination in India is found in the field of disability. Women and girls with disabilities are most times excluded from mainstream gender equality programs. They are not able to receive many of the provisions or the resources that would normally be offered and are unable to participate in most activities. Finally, let's look at the global perspective in the Philippines. I found this extremely interesting because it so sharply contrasted the previous two. In the Philippines, there's a generally positive attitude towards people with disabilities. In fact, relatives of people with disabilities often display a deep concern towards the family and are willing to give a lot towards them. In the Philippines, there is a high value on family, friends, and a faith in God. And I really believe that this impacts their view on disabilities. In the Philippines, the child with a disability becomes the priority. Parents often adjust their roles. Siblings assist in taking care of the child. Many times the siblings are expected to stop going to school in order to help out. And all of the family members feel obligated to direct their attention and effort to the child with a disability. In terms of time, money, and effort, the family often adjusts their lives and priorities in order to meet the child's needs. A lot of sacrifice happens for the disabled person, and one of the quotes that I found in talking about the culture of Filipinos and the way that they view disabilities is that there is no need for disabled persons to live physically and financially apart from their families. So they are extremely welcoming and place a lot of their focus on the person with a disability. In the Philippines, there is a large spiritual component in how they view people with disabilities. I found this super interesting that people with mental handicaps are often viewed as bringers of good luck, especially in the business arena. Another view, similar to that in China and India, is that the disability is a punishment by the evil spirits. However, whatever the cause, it's found that in the Philippines they embrace the idea of empowerment and attempt to teach the person with disability how to be a contributing part of the family.
Let's look at some implications for counselors. Be knowledgeable of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and other related laws and mandates. This includes looking to see if there's anything specific to your state that you should be aware of. Also, make accommodations if necessary, and be aware of resources that are available in your community for people with disabilities.
It's important to continue to practice self-awareness and reflection. While classes like this one help us get started in our process of recognizing stereotypes and biases in our society, it's definitely crucial to remember that this is an ongoing process. It's not just reflecting one time, it's reflecting for the rest of your life as a counselor. Also, think about the language you use and how you talk about people with disabilities and disabilities in general. And lastly, make sure to advocate for your clients in the best way that you can. Here are some suggested ways that I found for talking about disabilities and for talking about people with disabilities. It's important to not use the word normal when you refer to a person without disabilities. This gives the impression that a person with a disability is abnormal. Another important aspect is to use person-first language, and this is about talking about the person first and then the disability.
So both Megan and I are on the school counseling track, and so we were interested in looking at what this specifically means in a school setting. So we met with one of the ladies who works at the disability office here on campus, who was previously a special education teacher and also previously taught in the college level people who desired to be special education teachers. And one of the things she mentioned was the need to educate parents and teachers. This can be done in several ways. The first is doing in-service presentations for the teachers and the administration in presenting what a disability is and what a disability isn't. The problem with this is that oftentimes students' disabilities differ greatly, and so doing a general in-service doesn't often give them a lot of information. It would be helpful in knowing what students are coming up and coming to your school with disabilities and meeting with their teachers to help them better understand their student and how they can best help them as an individual. Another thing that she mentioned was the impact that teachers and parents have on the reactions of other students towards the student with a disability. For example, with a behavior disordered student who acts up in class a lot, if the teacher doesn't understand their disability and just ends up getting frustrated with them all the time, the impact that it will have on other students will be that they will also react in frustration to this student as well. This will not help them or their behavior improve at all. Another thing she mentioned was informing teachers about hidden disabilities, things that they are unable to see, going along with the behavior disordered students. By informing them and making them aware of what these could be, this will also help them in their reactions to students.
And lastly, when we met with Jennifer, she talked about the importance of empowering students with disabilities to become their own advocate. She made the point that when students and young children are in school, it's the school's job to be testing for disabilities and to be providing resources. However, when students move from secondary education into higher education, sometimes professors won't be aware of any disabilities unless the student advocates for themselves and lets them know what they need. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask us in class this weekend.
At the end of this video, please click the other link that will lead you to a personal interview that we did with Matt Taylor, where he will talk about his own personal experiences with living with a disability.